The emergency room of St. Jude's Memorial was usually a symphony of controlled chaos, a place where the steady beep of heart monitors and the hurried squeak of rubber-soled shoes against linoleum formed the soundtrack of survival. Dr. Arthur Vance was a man who prided himself on being the conductor of that symphony. At 42, he had the silver-streaked hair, the steady hands, and the cool, detached demeanor of a seasoned trauma surgeon who believed he had seen every iteration of human suffering and triumph the world had to offer. He believed in protocols, in hierarchies, and in the absolute certainty of his own medical authority. But on a rainy Tuesday night in October, a single voice would shatter that certainty entirely, turning his sterile, orderly world completely upside down. It began with the arrival of a temporary transfer nurse, a woman whose paperwork listed her simply as Elena Vance, though she claimed no relation to the doctor. When a mass casualty alert flashed across the screens, Arthur expected the usual frantic rush, but what he didn't expect was for this quiet, unassuming woman to suddenly step into the center of the trauma bay and take absolute, terrifying control. The moment she opened her mouth, the soft-spoken nurse vanished, replaced by someone who spoke with the icy, unyielding authority of a battlefield general. Arthur froze, his scalpel hovering in midair, because the commands echoing through the room weren't just efficient. They were delivered in a specific, haunting cadence he hadn't heard in 15 years, since the darkest night of his life in a forward operating base in the middle of a desert war zone. To understand the chill that ran down Arthur's spine, one had to understand the walls he had built around himself. Arthur was a man who lived in the present because the past was a minefield he refused to walk through. He was respected by his peers, but loved by none. He kept his conversations strictly professional and his personal life entirely non-existent. He arrived at the hospital at dawn, left long after dark, and filled the quiet hours of his life with medical journals and classical music. His colleagues whispered that he had a heart of stone, but the truth was much more fragile. His heart was a piece of glass that had been shattered and poorly glued back together, and he knew that any strong emotional vibration would reduce it to dust. The hospital was his sanctuary because rules applied there. If you followed the procedure, the patient usually lived. If they died, it was because the injury was too great, not because the system failed. He found comfort in that logic. It was a stark contrast to the unpredictable horror of his youth, a time he never spoke about to anyone, not even the hospital chief who had hired him based on his stellar record without questioning the gap in his resume from over a decade ago. Elena entered the staff lounge at the beginning of the shift with a worn duffel bag and a quiet nod to the charge nurse. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair tied back in a severe, no-nonsense bun, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She didn't join in the casual gossip about the upcoming hospital gala or the complaints about the cafeteria food. Instead, she quietly checked the inventory of the trauma carts, her fingers moving with a practiced, deliberate speed that caught Arthur's eye as he poured his third cup of black coffee. He watched her for a moment, noting the way she organized the surgical trays, placing the clamps and scalpels in a configuration that wasn't standard for St. Jude's, but was undeniably more accessible for a left-handed surgeon. Arthur was left-handed. He narrowed his eyes, wondering if it was a coincidence, but brushed it off. The world was full of small coincidences, and he had a chest tube to insert in cubicle 4. He walked past her without saying a word, and she didn't look up, her focus entirely consumed by the stainless steel instruments in front of her. The storm outside intensified as the night wore on, the wind howling against the thick glass of the ER windows, bringing with it a sense of impending dread that seasoned medical workers could always feel in their bones. At exactly 11:15, the red emergency phone began to ring, its harsh, rhythmic blare instantly cutting through the ambient noise of the department. The paramedic on the other end was breathless, reporting a multi-car pileup on the nearby interstate involving a tour bus and several commercial vehicles. The estimated arrival time for the first wave of critical patients was less than 10 minutes. The ER immediately sprang into action, a flurry of activity as nurses prepped lines, technicians rolled in portable X-ray machines, and the on-call residents lined up, waiting for instruction. Arthur stood at the head of Trauma Bay 1, the designated captain of the ship, preparing his mind for the onslaught. He took a deep breath, adjusting his surgical gloves, ready to dictate the rhythm of the room as he had done hundreds of times before. The automatic doors hissed open, and the first gurney burst through, covered in blood and mud. The paramedic was actively performing chest compressions on a young man whose chest was crushed. The room descended into a chaotic cacophony of shouting voices, vital signs monitor alarms, and the tearing of sterile packaging. Arthur began shouting orders, his voice loud but measured, trying to direct the residents to secure the airway. But the resident, a young man in his first year of trauma rotation, panicked. He couldn't visualize the vocal cords. His hands were shaking violently, and the patient's oxygen saturation levels were plummeting into the single digits. Arthur stepped forward to take the laryngoscope himself, but before he could reach the bed, a voice cut through the noise like a thunderclap, possessing a terrifying, booming resonance that instantly silenced every other sound in the room. "Step aside, doctor. Prepare for a surgical airway. Resident, drop the scope. Hold C-spine stabilization now. Nurse Thomas, O-negative blood on the rapid infuser. Push it now. Move, move, move." The orders were delivered with a ferocious, military cadence, a style of speech that didn't request or suggest, but absolute commanded obedience through sheer force of will. The room froze for a fraction of a second, the sheer authority in the voice paralyzing the staff into compliance. Arthur's head snapped up, his chest tightening as if a physical weight had been dropped onto his sternum. He looked across the bed and met the eyes of Elena. The quiet, reserved transfer nurse was gone. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin tucked, her eyes burning with a fierce, calculating intensity that belonged on a battlefield, not a civilian hospital. But it wasn't just her demeanor that froze Arthur's blood in his veins. It was the specific terminology she used, the exact sequencing of commands, and the terrifyingly familiar rasp in her vocal cords. It was the exact vocal blueprint of Sergeant Major Marcus Vance, Arthur's older brother, who had died in his arms 15 years ago in a collapsed field hospital in Fallujah. For a terrifying moment, Arthur couldn't breathe. The sounds of the modern ER faded, replaced by the ghost echo of mortar fire and the smell of burning copper and dust. He stared at Elena, his mind screaming that this was impossible, that his brother was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, that this woman couldn't possibly know the secret tactical medical commands that Marcus had invented for their specific unit. But there was no time to process the existential shock. The patient was dying. Elena didn't wait for Arthur to recover. She grabbed a scalpel from the tray she had rearranged specifically for a left-handed surgeon, and slapped the handle directly into Arthur's palm with a force that stung his skin. "Cricothyroidotomy, doctor. Right now? Stop staring and save this soldier," she barked, her voice dropping into a register that was so uncannily identical to his late brother's command voice that Arthur's hands acted on pure, deep-seated muscle memory before his conscious brain could even catch up. Arthur's fingers moved with surgical precision, incising the neck, inserting the tube, and securing the airway in a matter of seconds. The patient's chest began to rise and fall rhythmically, the monitor beep shifting from a frantic, high-pitched whine back into a stable, reassuring thumping. The room held its collective breath, the residents staring at Elena with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. No nurse had ever spoken to Dr. Vance that way, let alone a temporary hire on her first shift. Arthur looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly, then looked up at Elena. She didn't offer a smile or an explanation. She simply nodded once, a brief, military acknowledgement of a task completed, and immediately turned her attention to the next gurney rolling through the door. "Trauma 2, we have a penetrating abdominal wound. I need a laparotomy kit and a major vascular tray ready in 3 minutes," she shouted, directing the other nurses who moved instantly, entirely swept up in her command structure. Throughout the grueling hours that followed, the ER operated with an efficiency it had never seen before. Elena didn't just assist. She coordinated the entire floor, anticipating every complication before it arose, positioning staff like chess pieces on a board. She used terms that weren't taught in civilian nursing schools. She spoke of triage categories, evacuation windows, and field dressing protocols. To the rest of the staff, she was simply an incredibly intense, highly capable trauma nurse with an aggressive management style. But to Arthur, Every word she uttered was a knife turning in an old wound. He watched her movements, the precise way she carried her weight, the subtle scar on her inner wrist that looked like a fragment wound, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes when looking at catastrophic injuries. He felt like he was walking through a dream, a waking nightmare where the ghost of his past had taken the form of a woman who was currently running his department better than he ever could. By the time the sun began to peek through the gray rain clouds, the storm had passed, and the influx of patients had finally slowed to a trickle. The ER was a battlefield of discarded wrappers, empty blood bags, and exhausted staff slouched in chairs. Arthur stood at the central nursing station, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, but he wasn't reading the charts. He was staring at Elena's digital profile in the hospital database. It was completely standard. She had a nursing degree from a reputable university, a list of excellent references from various hospitals across the country, and no military record listed on her public resume. It didn't make sense. The way she had spoken, the exact phrases she used, like holding the line and prioritizing the red tags, were unique to the 82nd Airborne Medical Detachment Arthur had served in. They were phrases his brother Marcus had coined during their deployment, a personalized shorthand to keep their specific team focused amidst the chaos of incoming artillery. Arthur closed the laptop with a snap, his jaw clenched. He couldn't let it go. The ghost was too real, the implication too disturbing. He stood up and walked down the quiet hallway toward the staff locker room, knowing she would be packing her things to leave. He found her standing by her locker, stuffing her stethoscope into her duffel bag, her expression once again quiet, reserved, and entirely disconnected from the commander she had been just an hour prior. She looked up as he entered, her face an unreadable mask. Arthur closed the heavy wooden door behind him, locking out the rest of the hospital, leaving only the sound of the hum of the vending machine in the corner. "Who are you?" Arthur asked, his voice low, thick with a decade and a half of repressed emotion. He didn't use his usual authoritative doctor voice. He sounded like a man pleading for a lifeline in a dark room. Elena didn't blink. She zipped up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and faced him directly. The lack of deference in her posture was palpable. "I'm Elena, Dr. Vance. I'm the agency nurse assigned to your department for the week. I believe my paperwork is entirely in order. Don't play games with me," Arthur said, stepping closer, his hands fist clenching at his sides. "The way you ran that bay tonight, the phrases you used. You didn't learn that in nursing school. You didn't learn that at a civilian hospital. You used Marcus's protocols, word for word. You spoke exactly the way he did when the perimeter was breached at Station Echo. How do you know those words? How do you know how a left-handed surgeon prefers his tray arranged before I even ask for it?" A small, sad smile touched the corner of Elena's lips, breaking her stern facade for the very first time. It was a look of profound, heavy weariness, the look of someone who had carried a secret across a vast distance and had finally reached the destination. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver object, placing it gently on the wooden bench between them. It was a set of military dog tags, clinking softly against the wood. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the dent on the edge of the metal. He recognized the serial number engraved on the surface. They belonged to Marcus. "He didn't die in that tent because of an enemy mortar, Arthur," Elena said softly, her voice no longer booming, but carrying a heavy, echoing sorrow that made the room feel incredibly small. "He died trying to shield a field civilian nurse who had wandered into the crossfire. He died shielding me." Arthur stared at the tags, the room spinning around him. The official report he had received 15 years ago stated that Marcus had been killed during a direct artillery strike on the medical compound, a tragic casualty of war. Arthur had been in a different sector that night, arriving only in time to see his brother's body being loaded into a black bag. He had spent the last 15 years torturing himself with the thought that if he had just been closer, if he had been the surgeon on duty in that specific tent, he could have saved him. He had built his entire career on that guilt, becoming a machine of perfection so he would never fail another patient the way he felt he had failed his own flesh and blood. "What are you talking about?" Arthur whispered, his voice cracking, the polished exterior of the brilliant Dr. Vance completely disintegrating. The report said it was a direct hit. It said everyone in the tent was obliterated. The report was a cover to protect the intelligence operation happening in that village, Elena explained, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. I wasn't a military nurse back then. I was a local volunteer, a young woman trying to help my people. When the shelling started, I panicked. I ran the wrong way, right into the impact zone. Marcus saw me. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about his own safety or the protocols. He tackled me into a trench, covering my body with his own. The shrapnel took him, Arthur, not the blast. He bled out while holding me down, making sure I didn't move until the sky stopped falling. Arthur fell onto the bench, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the cold silver of his brother's dog tags. The weight of a 15-year-old lie was crushing him, rewriting the history of his grief in a single moment. Why are you here now? Why did you come to this hospital? Because he spent his final minutes talking about you, Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she sat down on the bench beside him, keeping a respectful distance but offering the solidarity of shared pain. He didn't talk about the war, or the country, or the medals. He talked about his little brother, the brilliant medical student who was left-handed and always complained that the surgical instruments were designed for the right-handed world. He told me how you used to practice suturing on oranges in your dorm room. He made me promise that if I survived, I would live a life worthy of the sacrifice. He told me to find you, eventually, and tell you that he wasn't angry that you weren't there. He was grateful you were safe in the rear sector. Elena wiped a single tear from her cheek, her expression hardening back into the resilient Commander Arthur had seen in the ER. It took me 10 years to get my citizenship, to get through nursing school, to learn the language perfectly, and to track down where you were practicing. I spent years studying his journals, the letters he wrote home, learning the specific way he ran his medical teams because I wanted to understand the man who saved me. I wanted to be able to stand in a room with you and not be a burden, but someone who could hold the line alongside Marcus's brother. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ghosts of a war fought thousands of miles away and a grief carried silently through the hallways of a quiet city hospital. Arthur looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw not a stranger, but a living testament to his brother's courage. The guilt that had weighed on his shoulders for 15 years, the phantom burden that had isolated him from the world, suddenly felt lighter. Marcus hadn't died because of a failure of medicine or a failure of his brother's presence. He had died performing the ultimate act of a healer, protecting a life at the cost of his own. Arthur reached out, his fingers closing around the dog tags, pulling them into his palm and squeezing until the metal edges bit into his skin, a sharp, grounding pain that reminded him he was alive. He looked up at Elena, his eyes wet, but for the first time in 15 years, a genuine, warm smile broke through his exhaustion. You ran a hell of a bay tonight, Nurse Vance, Arthur said, his voice steadying, honoring her with the name she had chosen to carry. Elena stood up, slinging her duffel bag back over her shoulder, the fierce, commanding light returning to her eyes, but tempered now with a deep, mutual understanding. We have another shift tomorrow night, Doctor. I expect your trays to be perfectly arranged. As she walked out of the locker room, the door swinging shut behind her, Arthur remained on the bench for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the hospital waking up for the day's shift. The storm outside had completely cleared, leaving behind a bright, crisp morning sky. He realized then that the truest scars are never the ones etched into our skin by fire or steel, but the ones left on our souls by the people who loved us enough to die for us. And the greatest honor we can offer them is not to mourn their absence, but to live our lives with the same fierce, uncompromising courage they used to protect ours.